There is a quiet place in the far north where two modern nations meet, not across forests or rivers, but on a wind-carved rock in a frozen sea. A place where flags were once raised and removed in silence, where bottles were left as messages, and where a border was drawn so gently that few people on earth will ever stand upon it. At first, it seems almost impossible that a country as vast as Canada could share any boundary at all with distant European powers. And yet, in the slow unfolding of history, it does. Not through conquest or sudden expansion, but through centuries of exploration, survival, and careful diplomacy. Because today, in the high Arctic, Canada shares a land border with Denmark, not through mainland Europe, but through Denmark's autonomous territory of Greenland. And that border exists on a single rocky island set in the narrow waters of the Nares Strait, an island known as Hans Island. To understand how this unlikely border came to be, we must travel backward into a time before maps, before treaties, before any concept of ownership over the Arctic at all. Long before European explorers ever glimpsed these northern waters, the Arctic was already home to the Inuit, whose presence across the polar regions stretches back thousands of years. For them, this was not a frontier. It was a lived world, a network of hunting grounds, seasonal movements, and oral knowledge carried across generations. The channels and ice that surround Hans Island were part of that world, crossed in kayaks in summer, traversed by sled in winter. There were no borders here, only pathways, only memory, only life in motion. Centuries passed in this rhythm before distant civilizations began to look northward. By the late 10th century, Norse settlers from Greenland, then a remote extension of Scandinavian exploration, began reaching parts of North America. Though their settlements would fade with time, their journeys hinted at a future in which the Arctic would become a zone of curiosity and ambition for European powers. But it was not until the 16th and 17th centuries that European exploration truly pressed into the high Arctic. Driven by the search for a northern sea route to Asia, expeditions from England and other nations entered the maze of Arctic waterways. Ships moved slowly through ice-choked passages. Maps were drawn from incomplete observations. Coastlines were guessed at more than fully understood. And among these scattered discoveries were the channels that would later define the geography between Greenland and the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Even then, Hans Island itself remained little more than a point of rock, unmapped, unnamed, and largely unnoticed. For centuries, it remained that way, a silent island in a silent sea. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Arctic began to take on greater importance for European empires. Exploration became more systematic. Expeditions were launched not only to find trade routes, but to claim knowledge, and by extension, territory. Greenland, already long associated with Denmark, became more formally integrated into Danish administration. Meanwhile, Britain, then responsible for what would later become Canada, extended its understanding and mapping of the Canadian Arctic. Yet even as these spheres of influence grew closer together, the precise boundaries between them remained undefined. The Arctic was vast, remote, and in many places uninhabited by permanent settlements. There was little urgency to define every island and channel. Hans Island remained in that quiet ambiguity. It was not until the mid-19th century that the island began to appear more clearly in Western records. During expeditions searching for the lost Franklin expedition, explorers entered the Nares Strait and charted the surrounding geography in greater detail. One of these expeditions gave the island its modern name, Hans Island, after Hans Hendrik, an Inuit guide who assisted European explorers navigating the treacherous Arctic environment. Still, naming the island did not settle its ownership. That question would wait for another century. As Canada moved toward Confederation in 1867, its northern territories were gradually defined as part of the Dominion of Canada. Meanwhile, Greenland remained firmly within the Danish realm. Two separate national spheres, one North American, one European, stood on either side of the same narrow channel, and between them, Hans Island remained unclaimed in any formal legal sense. As the 20th century began, the Arctic slowly shifted from a distant curiosity to a region of strategic importance. Advances in navigation, the development of international law, and growing interest in polar resources all contributed to a new urgency in defining boundaries. Countries began to clarify their northern limits, and in the years that followed the Second World War, Canada and Denmark both took steps to formalize their Arctic territories. Yet even as maps became more precise, one small detail remained unresolved: Hans Island. In 1973, Canada and Denmark signed a maritime boundary agreement that carefully divided the waters of the Nares Strait between them. Line by line, coordinate by coordinate, the boundary was drawn, except for one small gap. Right at the location of Hans Island, the negotiators, unable to reach a final agreement on the island's ownership, chose to leave that portion unresolved. It was, in many ways, a quiet acknowledgement that not all questions needed immediate answers. And so, for nearly 50 years, Hans Island existed in a kind of diplomatic limbo. Both countries considered it theirs. Neither enforced that claim with force, and what followed became one of the most unusual territorial disputes in modern history. Beginning in the 1980s, officials from Canada and Denmark began making occasional visits to the island. When Canadian personnel arrived, they would raise the Canadian flag. Sometimes they left behind a small bottle of Canadian whiskey. Later, Danish personnel would arrive. They would lower the Canadian flag, raise the Danish flag, and leave behind a bottle of schnapps. No soldiers, no conflict. Just a quiet, almost playful exchange of symbols in a place so remote that only a handful of people would ever witness it. Over time, this ritual became known informally as the Whiskey War, a dispute conducted not through aggression, but through gesture. Yet beneath this light tone, the question of sovereignty remained. As the 21st century began, new factors made the Arctic more important than ever before. Climate change began altering the region. Sea ice thinned. New shipping routes became possible. Access to natural resources drew increased attention. In this changing environment, even small territorial questions took on new significance. Canada and Denmark both recognized that leaving Hans Island unresolved indefinitely was no longer ideal. And so, quiet negotiations resumed. Over the course of the 2000s and 2010s, diplomats, legal experts, and survey teams worked together to examine the island's geography, history, and potential solutions. Rather than framing the issue as a contest to be won, both countries approached it as a shared problem to be solved. The tone remained cooperative. measured, patient. As the decades passed, a solution slowly came into view. Rather than awarding the island entirely to one country or the other, why not divide it? A simple line across the island's surface, respecting both claims, creating for the first time a direct land border between Canada and Denmark. It was a modest idea, but in its simplicity, it carried a quiet significance. Because in a world where borders have so often been shaped by conflict, this one would be shaped by agreement. Finally, in 2022, that agreement was reached. Canada and Denmark formally signed a treaty dividing Hans Island roughly in half. The boundary followed a natural feature across the island's terrain. On one side, Canadian territory, connected to the Arctic region of Nunavut. On the other, Danish territory, connected to Greenland. The Whiskey War came to an end. The flags could remain where they were placed. And for the first time in history, Canada and Denmark became land neighbors. The border itself is only about 1.2 kilometers long. Short, remote, almost invisible on most maps. And yet, it represents something much larger. A demonstration that even in regions shaped by extreme conditions and long histories, nations can choose cooperation over conflict. Today, Hans Island remains uninhabited. Winds still sweep across its rocky surface. Ice still forms and breaks in the surrounding waters. The island does not feel the presence of its new border. But for the countries that share it, the meaning is clear. A boundary drawn not in anger, but in understanding. And as the Arctic continues to evolve in the years ahead, with new routes opening, new challenges emerging, and new opportunities appearing, the story of this small island will remain a quiet reminder of what is possible when nations choose patience over rivalry. Far to the south of the Arctic silence, where the cold gray Atlantic rolls steadily against rugged coastlines, another story unfolds, one that began centuries earlier, in an age when empires stretched their reach across oceans, and the map of North America was still being drawn in uncertainty and ambition. Here, just beyond the southeastern edge of Newfoundland, lie a small group of windswept islands that carry a different kind of history, a European history, a French history. These islands are known as Saint Pierre and Miquelon. They are small in size, just a scattering of land in the vast Atlantic. But their presence represents one of the last physical traces of an empire that once stretched across much of North America. To understand how France came to remain here, just off Canada's coast, we must move backward in time again, back to the early 16th century, when European fishermen first began crossing the Atlantic in search of the rich fishing grounds surrounding Newfoundland. Among them were French sailors who quickly recognized the extraordinary abundance of cod in these waters. Season after season, they returned. Temporary camps became seasonal outposts, and gradually, these waters became a vital part of France's Atlantic economy. By the early 1500s, French explorers, including Jacques Cartier, had begun mapping the Gulf of St. Lawrence and establishing France's early presence in North America. In the decades that followed, this presence expanded into what became known as New France, a vast colonial territory stretching deep into the continent. The islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon became an important base for French fishermen operating along the Newfoundland coast. They offered shelter from Atlantic storms, a place to dry and process fish, and a foothold in waters that would become fiercely contested. Because as the centuries moved forward, France was not alone in its ambitions. Britain, too, was expanding its influence in North America, and the rivalry between these two empires would shape the future of the continent. Through a series of conflicts in the 17th and early 18th centuries, control of territories shifted back and forth. Fishing rights, trade routes, and strategic positions all became points of tension. The turning point came in 1713 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht. Under its terms, France ceded control of Newfoundland to Britain, but it did not lose everything. France retained limited fishing rights along certain coastal areas, and more importantly, it retained the small islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. These islands became the last remnant of French sovereignty in the region, a fragment of a once vast colonial empire. For the next several decades, life on the islands continued in a fragile balance. French fishermen used them as seasonal bases. Small communities took root, but their future remained uncertain, because the struggle between France and Britain was not yet over. During the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, France lost nearly all of its North American possessions to Britain. New France as a continental empire came to an end. Yet once again, Saint Pierre and Miquelon survived as French territory. Returned to France after brief occupations, the islands became even more symbolically important. They were no longer part of a vast network of colonies. They were all that remained. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the islands passed through cycles of British occupation and French return, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. But after 1816, they remained permanently French. And slowly, a stable community developed. Fishing families settled year-round. Harbors filled with small vessels. The rhythm of life was set by the sea, the weather, and the annual cod harvest. Even as Canada emerged as a nation in 1867, these islands remained separate. Politically part of France, geographically part of North America, culturally a blend of both. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the island's economy continued to depend heavily on the cod fishery. Drying racks lined the shores, warehouses filled with salted fish bound for European markets. But the modern world was changing. Industrial fishing methods increased pressure on fish stocks. International agreements began to regulate access to the North Atlantic. And gradually, the economic foundation of Saint Pierre and Miquelon began to shift. During the early 20th century, the islands found themselves involved in global events far beyond their size. In World War I and World War II, their strategic location in the North Atlantic gave them a quiet but significant role in maritime operations and transatlantic movement. During the Second World War, the islands even became a point of political tension between Free French forces and other Allied powers over control and allegiance. Yet through these moments, the islands remained firmly French, their identity intact. Their connection to France sustained across thousands of kilometers of ocean. In the decades that followed the war, the cod fishery, once the lifeblood of the islands, declined sharply due to overfishing and changing environmental conditions. By the late 20th century, new economic models were needed. France supported the islands as an overseas collectivity. Infrastructure improved, public services expanded, and the islands adapted to a new era, balancing traditional fishing with tourism, administration, and cultural preservation. Meanwhile, Canada and France worked to define the maritime boundaries surrounding the islands. Because while Saint Pierre and Miquelon remained French land, they sat within waters that were closely connected to Canada's Atlantic provinces. Fishing rights became a central issue. Negotiations stretched on for years. Finally, in 1992, an international arbitration decision defined a maritime boundary that granted the islands a limited economic zone extending into the Atlantic. It was not as large as France had hoped, but it provided a framework for coexistence. And once again, diplomacy prevailed over conflict. Today, Saint Pierre and Miquelon remains the last vestige of New France in North America. Its population is small, just a few thousand residents. Its streets carry French names. Its schools follow French systems. Its culture reflects centuries of connection to Europe. And yet, geographically, it sits just 16 miles from the Canadian coast. On a clear day, the proximity is unmistakable. The islands do not share a land border with Canada, but their closeness creates a different kind of boundary, a maritime edge, one defined not by fences or checkpoints, but by lines drawn carefully across the ocean. Together with the Arctic border shared with Denmark, this southern connection with France forms a quiet pair of relationships that link Canada directly to Europe. Two distant nations, two small territories, two borders shaped not by conflict, but by time, negotiation, and patience. And in both cases, the result is something rare: stability. Because in a world where borders are often sites of tension, these edges of Canada tell a different story. A story of how history can evolve into coexistence, how old rivalries can give way to cooperation, how even the smallest pieces of land can carry centuries of meaning. As the 21st century continues to unfold, these relationships remain steady. Canada and Denmark share their Arctic island. Canada and France share neighboring waters. And across these quiet frontiers, life goes on. Fishing boats still leave the harbors of Saint Pierre at dawn. Ice still drifts past Hans Island in the long polar night. And the borders that connect these places remain almost invisible to the people who live near them. But their significance endures, because they remind us that borders are not only lines of division, they can also be points of connection, places where histories meet, where cultures touch, where nations choose cooperation over conflict. And as the tides move in and out along the Newfoundland coast, and the Arctic winds continue to sweep across that silent island in the north, these distant edges of Canada remain linked to Europe in ways that are both ancient and ongoing, quietly, steadily, and far beyond the view of most of the world, a reminder that history does not always end with a treaty or a line on a map. Sometimes it continues, softly, patiently, into the present, and onward into the future.